In complex aviation systems, authority is rarely held by a single hand. It is divided, delegated, and distributed across agencies whose boundaries do not always align with the boundaries of risk. The FAA placed Helicopter Route 4 in close proximity to the runway 33 approach path at Reagan National Airport, and did so without procedural mitigations to separate helicopter and fixed-wing traffic. The route existed, the conflict existed, and on the night of the accident, conditions were clear. Night visual meteorological conditions, the kind that offer no natural barrier to visibility, no easy excuse. What was visible to the eye was also visible in the data. The hazard had a shape. It had a location. What it did not have was an owner.
When a hazard is visible, the assumption is that someone will act. But visibility and ownership are not the same thing. Route 4 sat beside the runway 33 approach with no procedure to separate the two. A collision risk in plain view. The risk was not hidden. It appeared in multiple data sources. Air traffic control personnel raised concerns repeatedly. And yet the FAA Air Traffic Organization did not regularly review or reevaluate the route, as its own procedures required. The hazard occupied every domain. The obligation to fix it seemed to occupy none. The data existed. Across multiple organizations in multiple forms, the picture of risk had already assembled itself. The FAA had built the conflict into the airspace. Air traffic control personnel had raised concerns repeatedly. Recommendations to mitigate mid-air collision risk had been made. The FAA did not act on them. The Army, too, held evidence of risk. Regular exceedances of the published helicopter route altitudes that pointed toward the same hazard. But the Army's safety management system was not yet fully implemented or integrated into its aviation operations, and so those signals never resolved into action. Industry stakeholders carried radar and route data of their own. The FAA, the Army, and those stakeholders each held a piece of the same puzzle. None of them shared it in a way that allowed the full picture to emerge. This is what a structural gap looks like from the inside. Not darkness, but fragmented light. Each organization illuminating its own corner of the hazard, none with a mandate to hold the whole. The absence of effective data sharing, integration, and analysis among these organizations directly hindered the identification and mitigation of recurring hazards in the DCA terminal area. The risk was visible across the system. Ownership of the fix belonged to no one. Every safety management system depends on a simple premise, that risk signals, once visible, will reach the people positioned to act on them. But the Army's system contained a gap that no one had closed. Helicopter pilots were not adequately informed about the effects of allowable error tolerances in barometric altimeters, a technical limitation that, in practice, meant crews could believe they were within limits while flying above them. That gap had a concrete consequence. The accident helicopter was operating at or above the published maximum route altitude of 200 feet mean sea level, elevated there, in part, by the very altimeter tolerances its crew had not been trained to account for. The signal was there. The altitude exceedance was real and measurable. What the system lacked was not data. It was a mechanism to translate that data into corrective understanding at the cockpit level. This is how a latent flaw sustains itself, not through dramatic failure, but through ordinary silence. Repeated exposures to risk that pass through an organization without ever being owned, named, or fixed. Procedures exist for a reason. They are the system's memory, the accumulated record of what must be checked and how often, so that known dangers do not quietly become forgotten ones. The FAA failed to regularly review and evaluate Helicopter Route 4 as its own procedures required. A route that had been placed in close proximity to an active approach path sat largely unexamined, not because no one had written the rule to look at it, but because no one had enforced the habit of looking. This is how normalization works. A hazard does not announce itself as neglected. It simply persists, each passing cycle of inaction making the gap feel more ordinary than urgent. Air traffic control personnel had raised concerns. Recommendations had been issued, and still, the FAA did not act on the available information to mitigate the identified risk. The procedure that was meant to catch the problem existed. What did not exist was ownership. Someone, somebody, clearly accountable for ensuring that review actually happened across organizational lines. At the tower, one controller was working two positions simultaneously: helicopter control and local control, during a period of elevated traffic volume. In the cockpits, the crews faced their own narrowing window. It was night, and the city spread below them, a dense field of lights that offered no clean background against which to pick out a moving aircraft. Compounding that, the two aircraft were converging in a way that produced almost no relative motion in each crew's field of view. One of the most reliable ways for a collision threat to remain invisible until it is too late. By the time the two aircraft converged, the structural gaps in the system had found their moment. That combination degraded both performance and situational awareness at the precise moment they were needed most. This is how abstract organizational gaps become concrete outcomes. When the procedures that should bind separate domains together are absent, the burden falls on the humans at the end of the chain, and the conditions of that night left them almost nothing to work with. Every instrument has a margin of error. The question is whether the people relying on that instrument know how wide that margin can be. The Army had not ensured its helicopter pilots were adequately informed about the allowable error tolerances built into barometric altimeters. The consequence was precise and invisible. The accident helicopter crew, trusting their instruments, was flying at or above the published maximum route altitude of 200 feet mean sea level, unaware that tolerances in the very equipment they depended on had placed them there. This was not a crew that chose to exceed limits. It was a crew that had never been given the information that would have told them they were doing so. The knowledge existed within the system. The obligation to pass it down the chain of command did not find a clear owner, and so the crew flew on, converging with an approach corridor, carrying a hazard no one had told them they held. The helicopter crew was operating on a different radio frequency from the airliner. What the airplane crew heard, the helicopter crew did not. When the airliner began a circling approach to a different runway, a maneuver that would bring it across the helicopter's path, the transmissions describing that change never reached the helicopter crew. Degraded radio reception ensured they heard nothing. Without that information, the crew's mental picture of the traffic remained frozen at an earlier moment. They expected no conflict, and so they looked for none. The instructor pilot reported traffic in sight and requested visual separation. The controller approved. The crew was now responsible for their own clearance from an aircraft they believed they understood and had not positively identified. An incorrect expectation had shaped the visual scan. The crew saw traffic. They did not confirm it was the right traffic, on the right course, presenting the hazard it actually presented. This is how a hazard that existed in the data, in the charts, in the documented concerns of controllers, finally arrived in the cockpit, not as a warning, but as silence. When the controller, sensing the converging flight paths, asked whether the crew had the airplane in sight and instructed them to pass behind it, a brief, inadvertent transmission from within the helicopter blocked the critical phrase. The crew received the question. They did not receive the instruction. What failed in those final seconds was not one thing. It was the accumulated weight of information that had never arrived. Gaps in frequency, gaps in reception, gaps in identification. Each one small enough to overlook, together enough to be fatal. With the flight paths converging, the controller issued what should have been the decisive intervention, an instruction for the helicopter to pass behind the approaching aircraft. At that moment, one of the helicopter pilots pressed a radio push-to-talk switch for 0.8 seconds. And that brief, inadvertent transmission blocked the crew from receiving the critical pass behind portion of the controller's instruction. The word that would have changed their course never reached them. Without that instruction, the helicopter crew had no reason to revise their understanding of the situation. They had not received word of the airplane's circling approach to a different runway, and so their expectation held. No conflict ahead. This is what a gap in transmission looks like at the operational level. Not a failure of intent by any individual, but a fraction of a second that severed the one link connecting a controller's awareness to a crew's action. Technology designed to warn pilots of conflicting traffic operates within defined boundaries, boundaries that, in this airspace, had already been crossed. The helicopter was not equipped with integrated traffic awareness or collision avoidance technology that could have alerted its crew to the impending collision. No system aboard the helicopter would sound an alarm, generate a warning, or prompt evasive action, because no such system existed. When the technology that might have closed the gap was simply absent, the question of who was responsible for that absence and who had the authority to require something different returned, unanswered, to the organizations that had never claimed it. When accountability for a hazard is distributed across multiple organizations, the consequences eventually arrive where no system could intervene, in the final seconds before impact. Both flight crews were contending with a night sky filled with city lights, a backdrop that made it nearly impossible to isolate another aircraft against the visual noise below. A moving object draws attention. An object that appears stationary in the windscreen, growing almost imperceptibly larger, does not. And because the two aircraft were converging on nearly parallel headings, there was almost no relative motion between them, no lateral drift, no angular change to catch the eye. The crews were not inattentive. They were looking into a darkness alive with competing light, searching for an aircraft that offered no visual cue that it was there. This was the endpoint of an unowned risk, not a single decision left unmade, but a chain of structural gaps that left two crews, in those final moments, with nothing useful to see. Every domain had seen the hazard. Every jurisdiction had held a piece of the data. And yet, no single authority had ever owned the fix. The helicopter continued southbound along Route 4. The airplane descended on final approach to runway 33. Their flight paths met over the Potomac River at roughly 278 feet above mean sea level.
This is what an unowned risk looks like when it runs its course. Not a failure of detection, but a failure of ownership, playing out in the space between jurisdictions. In the aftermath, investigators faced a system that had generated warning after warning and acted on none of them. The FAA had placed the route beside the runway 33 approach without mitigations to separate the two streams of traffic, and then failed to regularly review or reevaluate it as its own procedures required. Concerns had been raised, recommendations had been made. The FAA failed to act on them. The Army, meanwhile, had access to evidence of its own. Helicopter crews were regularly exceeding the published route altitudes, a persistent signal that something was wrong. But the Army's safety management system was not yet fully implemented, and it could not capture what it could not yet see. And across all of it, the FAA, the Army, the industry stakeholders who held radar tracks and route data, there was no effective mechanism to bring that information together. The NTSB concluded that the absence of effective data sharing, integration, and analysis among these organizations hindered the identification and mitigation of recurring hazards in the terminal area. This is the anatomy of an unowned risk. Not a conspiracy of negligence, not a single catastrophic lapse, but a structural condition in which every organization held a piece of the picture, and no organization held responsibility for assembling it. When accountability is undefined in the gaps between jurisdictions, the hazard does not disappear. It simply waits.